The story usually begins without announcing itself. A child opens a textbook and sees a world already arranged. The oceans are blue and smooth. The continents are cleanly separated. Borders are firm. Names are familiar. The United States sits slightly to the left of center, balanced, proportional, calm. Nothing in the image suggests struggle, argument, or perspective. It looks neutral. It looks factual. It is neither. World history, as most Americans first encounter it, does not begin with a question. It begins with an orientation. Before dates or names appear, the student has already learned where to look, what matters, and what counts as movement. The map does the work before the text ever speaks. North America is centered. Europe is legible. Everything else is peripheral. This is not accidental. It is the quiet inheritance of power translated into pedagogy. The American telling of world history is rarely aggressive. It does not insist. It assumes. It assumes that history is a line moving forward, that progress has a direction, and that the direction eventually points here. It assumes that complexity increases over time, that ideas improve, and that societies mature toward something recognizable. It assumes that the present explains the past. The effect of this assumption is subtle but enduring. The world is not taught as a set of parallel human experiences unfolding simultaneously. It is taught as a long approach. Civilizations rise, interact, and fade as though making room. When the United States finally appears in the narrative, it does not feel like an interruption. It feels like arrival. This sense of arrival is the organizing principle of the American historical imagination. To understand it, one must begin where American world history usually begins, not with humanity, not with Africa, not with migration, but with inheritance. Ancient history appears first, but it is framed as origin rather than presence. Mesopotamia is introduced as the cradle of civilization, a phrase that already implies completion. A cradle is for infancy, not for living. Egypt follows, monumental and static, defined by pyramids rather than politics. Greece appears next, lively and argumentative, but always as a source of ideas rather than as a society that struggled, failed, and adapted over centuries. Rome enters as the great transmitter. Law, roads, order. Rome matters because it organizes chaos into something legible. When Rome falls, the story pauses. What follows is often described as a gap. The Middle Ages are compressed, simplified, or caricatured. Feudalism is sketched quickly. The church dominates. Innovation slows. The implication is not always stated, but it is felt. History is waiting for something to restart it. When the Renaissance arrives, it is described as a rebirth, not as a continuation. Europe wakes up. Art returns. Curiosity returns. Individualism appears. The narrative accelerates. Time begins to move faster. More names appear. More dates. More agency. This acceleration teaches an early lesson. History advances when people begin to resemble modern Americans in thought, behavior, and ambition. By the time students reach the age of exploration, the world has already been divided into actors and settings. Europe acts. The rest of the world is acted upon. The language used here is revealing. Explorers are bold. They set out. They push boundaries. The ocean is dangerous. The ships are small. The men are courageous. The emphasis is on risk, not on consequence. The lands they reach are described as new, even when populated by millions. Discovery is framed as a moment of revelation rather than intrusion. The world appears to open itself to European eyes, as though visibility itself confers legitimacy. In this telling, global contact begins when Europeans initiate it. Trade routes that existed for centuries are mentioned only briefly. Islamic scholars who preserved, expanded, and challenged classical knowledge are acknowledged, but often as intermediaries rather than innovators. China's technological advances are admired, but framed as early and inexplicably abandoned. Africa's complexity is reduced to regions, resources, and later, suffering. This structure creates a quiet hierarchy of historical agency. Some societies make history, others experience it. By the time colonialism enters the narrative in full, its moral complexity is softened by inevitability. Empires expand because they can. Resistance exists, but it is usually doomed. Collapse follows contact. Disease spreads, cultures fracture. These outcomes are lamented but rarely interrogated structurally. The question is not why this happened, but how quickly. This is where American world history begins to reveal its deepest assumption, that power and progress are naturally aligned. Europe expands because it is advanced. It dominates because it is dynamic. The world changes because change is forward movement. Loss becomes the price of momentum. This logic makes later American history easier to absorb. When the United States appears, it does not arrive as an empire in the European sense, it arrives as an exception, born from revolution, forged in ideals, hesitant to engage abroad. Its expansion is framed as settlement rather than conquest. Its conflicts are framed as tests rather than domination. The earlier narrative has prepared the ground. If history moves forward through exploration, innovation, and assertion, then America's rise feels less like repetition and more like fulfillment. This is not propaganda in the crude sense. It is coherence. The American telling of world history is coherent because it aligns past movement with present identity. It explains why the world looks the way it does by implying that it could not have unfolded otherwise. It minimizes contingency. It downplays alternatives. It smooths contradiction. Most importantly, it places Americans in the position of inheritors rather than beneficiaries. The difference matters. To inherit is to receive something earned by others. To benefit is to profit from structures that harmed others. The American narrative prefers inheritance. It frames modernity as something passed down through Europe, refined through struggle, and ultimately realized across the Atlantic. This framing does not require hostility toward the rest of the world. It only requires distance. Distance makes simplification possible. Distance makes imbalance invisible. By the time students reach the 19th century, the world has already been sorted. Europe industrializes, America follows. The rest of the world reacts. Colonization accelerates. Resistance appears sporadically. Maps fill with color-coded empires. The logic of dominance is visual and persuasive. The world is being organized. When slavery appears in this narrative, it is framed as tragedy, not system. The cruelty is acknowledged, the suffering is emphasized, but the economic centrality is often blurred. Slavery becomes a moral failure rather than a foundation. It is something that happened within history, not something that made modern history possible. This distinction allows the story to continue without fracture. By the time revolutions appear, their significance is measured by proximity to American values. The American Revolution is celebrated as ideological. The French Revolution is admired for its philosophy even as its violence is criticized. Other revolutions are described as chaotic, premature, or destabilizing. The message is implicit. Ideas matter most when they resemble ours. As the narrative approaches the 20th century, complexity increases, but orientation remains stable. World War I is confusing until America enters. World War II is global, but clarity arrives with American involvement. The Cold War is framed as a moral struggle with global stakes, but American agency anchors the story. Throughout, the rest of the world appears largely in relation to American decisions. This is not because American historians are unaware of global complexity. It is because educational narratives must simplify, and simplification follows power. What is most striking about world history, according to Americans, is not what it includes, but what it assumes. It assumes that history has a direction. It assumes that modernity is an achievement rather than a coincidence. It assumes that power reflects merit. It assumes that the present explains the past better than the past explains the present. These assumptions are rarely taught. They are absorbed. They shape how Americans understand conflict, development, and difference. They shape expectations about other societies. They shape reactions to global crises. They shape what feels surprising and what feels inevitable. To tell this story fully requires slowing down. It requires returning to moments that appear settled and asking whose perspective they serve. It requires examining not just events, but framing. This documentary does not seek to accuse or correct in a simplistic way. It seeks to understand. Because the American version of world history is not unique. Every society tells a story that places itself at the center. The difference is that America's story has become global enough to feel universal. And that is where the real tension begins. The tension becomes clearer when we look not at what Americans are taught, but at what they are taught to expect. World history in the American classroom trains intuition as much as it transmits information. It teaches students what kinds of developments feel normal and which feel aberrant. It teaches which regions are associated with initiative and which with reaction. It teaches which changes require explanation and which pass without comment. Industrialization in Britain makes sense. Industrialization in Japan requires a paragraph explaining how unusual it is. Democracy in Athens is foundational. Democracy in pre-colonial Africa is an exception. Scientific inquiry in Europe is progress. Scientific inquiry elsewhere is curiosity. These patterns do not come from explicit claims. They emerge from repetition, from emphasis, from pacing. American world history is paced around European and later American milestones. When those regions change, history moves. When others change, history pauses briefly, then returns to its main thread. This pacing teaches hierarchy without naming it. It also teaches inevitability. By framing modern political systems, economic structures, and cultural norms as the culmination of a long arc, the American narrative implies that alternatives were temporary deviations rather than viable paths. Empires rise and fall, but the world seems always to be moving toward liberal capitalism, nation-states, and technological dominance. That these developments emerged under very specific historical conditions, many of them violent, is acknowledged but rarely centered. Violence appears as an obstacle, not as a mechanism. Colonialism, for example, is often described as exploitation, oppression, and injustice. These are accurate descriptions. What is less emphasized is that colonialism was not merely abuse layered onto an otherwise neutral process of modernization. It was the process. Industrialization in Europe depended on resources extracted elsewhere. Wealth accumulation depended on coerced labor. Global trade networks depended on imperial control. In the American telling, these connections exist, but they are backgrounded. The story remains one of innovation overcoming hardship rather than advantage built on asymmetry. This framing has consequences for how Americans understand global inequality today. If history is a race toward modernity, then some societies are simply behind. If modernity is earned through innovation and effort, then disparities feel unfortunate but deserved. The structural roots, Centuries of extraction, disruption, and imposed dependency fade into abstraction. World history becomes a morality tale about development rather than a record of power. The Cold War crystallizes this tendency. In American narratives, the Cold War is not primarily about decolonization, proxy warfare, or global realignment. It is about ideology, freedom versus communism, democracy versus authoritarianism. The world is divided into camps. Countries appear as choices rather than as histories. Nations fall to communism. They are saved by intervention. They are lost when they choose wrongly. This language erases local conditions. Land reform movements, labor struggles, anti-imperial resistance, these become footnotes to a global moral drama centered on American responsibility. The United States is framed as reluctant but necessary. It does not seek dominance. It responds to threat. It intervenes to preserve order. This narrative prepares Americans to see themselves as global managers rather than participants. It reinforces the idea that American power is corrective, not constitutive, that it stabilizes rather than reshapes. When interventions fail, the failure is often attributed to misunderstanding, corruption, or cultural incompatibility rather than to the premise of intervention itself. History, once again, is smoothed. What is rarely taught is how different this story looks from elsewhere. In Latin America, the 20th century is remembered less as a Cold War battleground and more as a series of interrupted futures. Democratically elected governments overturned, economic experiments crushed, social movements destabilized. In Africa, the Cold War overlays an already traumatic process of decolonization, locking newly independent states into global struggles they did not choose. In Asia, the narrative is fractured. Revolution, partition, war, reconstruction, often with American involvement framed locally, not as rescue, but as disruption. These perspectives exist in scholarship, but they rarely shape the introductory narrative Americans encounter first. And first narratives matter. They become default lenses through which later information is interpreted. This is why American world history often feels confident even when incomplete. It rests on an assumption of moral clarity. The United States may make mistakes, but it intends good. The world may resist, but progress continues. History bends, eventually, toward something recognizable. This confidence shapes how Americans experience surprise. When events contradict the narrative, when countries develop along unexpected lines, when alliances shift, when resentment surfaces, these moments feel shocking rather than intelligible. The story did not prepare for them. The post-Cold War period is a case in point. In American world history, the collapse of the Soviet Union often feels like an ending. Ideological conflict resolves. Globalization accelerates. Liberal democracy spreads. The end of history thesis enters public consciousness. Other societies experience this moment differently. For many, the 1990s are not resolution, but exposure. Economic shocks, structural adjustment, state collapse, new inequalities, new dependencies. But the American narrative, having framed the Cold War as a moral struggle, interprets its end as validation. The story closes. What follows is treated less as history and more as current events, messy, contingent, unresolved. The past recedes, the present dominates. This transition reinforces a final assumption that the world has largely arrived, and what remains are adjustments. World history, in this sense, becomes a prelude to American-led modernity rather than an ongoing plural process. It is important to say what this analysis is not claiming. It is not claiming that American historians are ignorant. It is not claiming that classrooms deliberately mislead. It is not claiming that the American narrative is uniquely flawed. It is claiming that power shapes perspective, and perspective shapes memory. Every society tells a version of world history that places itself at the center. What makes the American version distinctive is its reach. Through media, education, and cultural influence, it has become familiar far beyond U.S. borders. For many people around the world, the American telling of global history is the first version they encounter, sometimes the only one available in accessible form. This gives it weight. It also gives it responsibility, because when one narrative becomes dominant, alternatives are not merely ignored, they are rendered strange. Local histories begin to feel secondary. Other timelines feel like deviations rather than parallel stories. The world becomes a single plot with many side characters. Understanding this does not require rejecting American history or values. It requires recognizing that no single vantage point can fully contain global experience. World history is not a straight road leading anywhere in particular. It is a dense network of paths, many of which were cut short, diverted, or erased. The American narrative selects one route and follows it confidently. It explains much. It leaves much unexplained. To move beyond it does not mean discarding it. It means situating it, placing it among other narratives rather than above them. That work begins by slowing down, by revisiting familiar moments and asking unfamiliar questions. What if ancient civilizations are not prologue, but presence? What if modernity is not destiny, but one outcome among many? What if progress is uneven, reversible, and costly by design? These questions do not undermine history. They deepen it, and they lead us to the next layer of this story. How American world history simplifies time itself, how it compresses, accelerates, and freezes different regions according to what they contribute to the central arc. That is where the narrative's most powerful distortions emerge. The distortion begins with time. In the American telling of world history, time does not move evenly. It speeds up and slows down depending on where you are. Some regions live in centuries, others are confined to moments. Some societies are allowed long arcs of development. Others appear only when they intersect with the main story and then vanish again. Europe, especially Western Europe, is granted duration. Its medieval period stretches across centuries, populated with kings, churches, debates, reforms, crises, and recoveries. Its early modern era unfolds patiently. Its revolutions are lingered over. Its wars are dissected. Elsewhere, time collapses. Africa moves from ancient to colonized in a few pages. Indigenous America leaps from pre-contact complexity to post-contact devastation with little space in between. Asia is ancient, then suddenly modern, with the transition often attributed to Western contact rather than internal dynamics. This uneven treatment teaches a powerful lesson. Some histories are continuous, others are episodic. Continuous histories feel alive. Episodic ones feel finished. Once a society is framed as finished, its golden age past, its relevance concluded, it becomes easier to treat it as background rather than participant. Its present struggles feel disconnected from its past agency. Its future feels derivative rather than generative. This is why American world history often treats non-Western modernity as imitation. Japan modernizes by adopting Western models. China reforms after Western pressure. India inherits democracy from Britain. The possibility that these societies were already grappling with modern questions on their own terms is acknowledged in advanced study, but rarely centered in foundational narratives. Modernity becomes something that spreads outward rather than something that emerges in many places under different conditions. This matters because it shapes how Americans interpret the present. If history teaches that innovation flows from the center outward, then leadership feels natural. If it teaches that others have always been catching up, then inequality feels persistent but unsurprising. If it teaches that progress has a single form, then alternative futures appear unrealistic. The American narrative does not usually say these things directly. It does something more effective. It normalizes them. Normalization is achieved through sequence. By placing certain developments earlier and others later, the story implies hierarchy without argument. By emphasizing some continuities and truncating others, it suggests inevitability without justification. Time itself becomes ideological. The compression of non-Western histories also simplifies causality. When centuries are reduced to summaries, complex processes appear sudden. Societies seem to change abruptly, often in response to external influence. Colonialism, for example, is frequently presented as a turning point rather than a transformation layered onto existing trajectories. Pre-colonial societies are introduced briefly, then colonial rule descends, reshaping everything. Resistance appears, but usually as reaction. What disappears is the sense that these societies were already changing, already debating, already struggling with power, inequality, belief, and governance. This erasure reinforces the idea that history happens to them rather than through them. It also allows American narratives to frame intervention as awakening rather than intrusion. If a society is static, intervention introduces motion. If it is passive, intervention introduces agency. If it is timeless, intervention introduces history. This logic underlies many of the most persistent misconceptions in American world history. Consider Africa. In many American textbooks, Africa appears first as the site of ancient civilizations, Egypt, Nubia, Axum, then largely disappears. When it reappears, it is as a source of enslaved people. Later, it reappears again as a colonized continent. Finally, it enters the modern era, marked by poverty, conflict, and instability. What is missing is continuity. African societies did not pause between these moments. They traded, innovated, governed, expanded, and contracted. They engaged with Islam, Christianity, and indigenous belief systems in complex ways. They developed political forms suited to their environments. They participated in global networks long before European dominance. But because American world history compresses this continuity, Africa feels perpetually disrupted rather than persistently adaptive. The result is a continent perceived as eternally recovering. Asia suffers a different distortion. Its depth is acknowledged, but its agency is constrained. China is described as ancient and sophisticated, but its later history is framed as decline, followed by Western intrusion. The Qing dynasty becomes a symbol of stagnation. The Opium Wars are presented as humiliations that force China into modernity. What is often lost is the internal debate within Chinese society about reform, governance, and identity, debates that predate Western pressure and continue independently of it. Similarly, India's history is frequently organized around colonial rule. Ancient India appears briefly. Mughal India is acknowledged for its splendor. Then British rule dominates the narrative. Independence follows. Modern India appears suddenly, grappling with inherited institutions. The long internal histories of resistance, reform, and adaptation are often secondary to the colonial frame. Latin America is perhaps the most compressed of all. Pre-Columbian civilizations are introduced, then conquered. Colonial societies form, then revolt. Independence movements occur, then instability follows. The 20th century becomes a sequence of coups, dictatorships, and interventions. This framing leaves little room for continuity or self-directed development. It teaches that Latin American history is cyclical failure rather than contested evolution. In all of these cases, American world history does not deny complexity. It postpones it. Complexity is something students might encounter later in college if they specialize. The foundational story remains streamlined, and foundational stories shape instinct. They shape what feels intuitive and what feels surprising. This is why many Americans are surprised when countries pursue paths that do not align with liberal democratic expectations. The narrative taught them that history flows toward a particular form. Deviations feel irrational rather than historically grounded. This also shapes moral judgment. If modernity is the destination, then societies that resist its dominant form appear stubborn or backward. Their choices are interpreted psychologically rather than historically. Culture becomes explanation rather than consequence. The American narrative encourages this by treating culture as static and structure as neutral. Europe industrializes because of ideas. Others do not because of tradition. This explanation is comforting because it absolves systems. Systems rarely appear as villains in American world history. Individuals do. Tyrants do. Extremists do. But systems, trade networks, financial regimes, imperial structures are treated as backdrops rather than engines. This personalization of history aligns with American political culture, which emphasizes individual agency and moral choice. It also simplifies storytelling, but it obscures how deeply interconnected global histories are. It obscures how American prosperity was shaped by global extraction, how European modernity was built on colonial labor, how technological advancement depended on unequal exchange. These facts exist in scholarship. They are mentioned, but they are rarely allowed to restructure the narrative itself. Instead, they appear as complications, and complications are easier to ignore than foundations. As the American world history narrative moves closer to the present, this structural framing becomes even more apparent. The 20th century is treated as a sequence of crises requiring response. World wars erupt. Ideologies clash, economies collapse. The United States enters reluctantly, acts decisively, and emerges influential. The pattern reinforces itself. America does not initiate disruption. America stabilizes it. This framing relies on earlier assumptions about history's direction. If progress is the norm, then crisis is interruption. If America embodies progress, then its interventions appear restorative rather than transformative. This logic persists into contemporary history. Globalization is framed as integration rather than reconfiguration. Economic liberalization is framed as opportunity rather than disruption. Technological spread is framed as diffusion rather than dependency. The American narrative treats these processes as natural extensions of historical momentum rather than as choices with winners and losers. By this point, the world has been fully oriented. The past leads here. The present explains the past. The future resembles the present. This is not indoctrination, it is coherence. A coherent story is easier to remember than a fractured one. It is easier to teach. It is easier to believe. And belief shapes action. How a society tells world history influences how it understands responsibility, power, and limitation. It influences foreign policy instincts. It influences public reaction to global suffering. It influences what feels urgent and what feels distant. The American narrative, for all its gaps, is powerful because it offers moral clarity in a complex world. It reassures Americans that their position is not accidental or unjustified. It frames global leadership as burden rather than privilege, but clarity comes at a cost. It flattens difference. It erases alternative trajectories. It turns contingency into destiny. To see this clearly does not require cynicism. It requires distance, enough distance to recognize that this is one way of telling the world's story, not the world's story itself. And that recognition opens the door to the next question. What happens when this narrative leaves the classroom and enters public life, when it shapes how Americans interpret real-time events across the globe? That is where world history, according to Americans, stops being academic and becomes consequential. When the narrative leaves the classroom, it does not disappear. It matures. It hardens into instinct, into reflex, into the background logic through which news is interpreted and policy is justified. By the time Americans encounter world events as adults, they are no longer thinking in terms of timelines or eras. They are thinking in terms of roles. Who is stable? Who is unstable? Who is progressing? Who is failing? These categories feel natural because they were learned early, embedded in the way history was organized long before current events ever appeared. When a country experiences conflict, the American instinct is often to ask, what went wrong? The question assumes that stability is the norm and disruption is deviation. But for much of the world, disruption has been the norm for centuries, often produced by the very global systems that American history treats as neutral or beneficial. This mismatch in expectation creates confusion, frustration, and moral impatience. Why haven't they stabilized yet? Why does democracy keep failing there? Why can't they move forward? These are not malicious questions. They are historically conditioned ones. American world history teaches that societies move through recognizable stages. Feudalism gives way to capitalism. Tradition gives way to modernity. Autocracy gives way to democracy. The sequence feels linear, almost biological. When reality does not conform, the deviation is attributed to culture, corruption, or incompetence rather than to historical context. This is where the narrative becomes dangerous, not because it is false, but because it is incomplete. An incomplete history encourages incomplete explanations. Consider how Americans often understand the Middle East. In the classroom, the region appears intermittently. Ancient Mesopotamia is foundational. Islamic civilization is introduced as intellectually rich, then quickly framed as declining. The Ottoman Empire appears briefly, usually as a sick man in its final centuries. Colonialism is mentioned, but often without depth. Independence movements appear, then instability follows. By the time modern conflicts enter the narrative, the region feels perpetually volatile. What is missing is the sense of sequence, the carving up of borders, the installation of client regimes, the disruption of economic systems, the Cold War interventions. These are often taught as isolated facts, rather than as a continuous process shaping the present. As a result, when Americans encounter contemporary Middle Eastern politics, the past feels irrelevant. Conflict appears as an expression of ancient hatred or religious difference rather than as the outcome of modern history. The same pattern appears elsewhere. In Africa, ongoing conflict is often discussed without reference to colonial borders that forced disparate groups into single states. In Latin America, migration is debated without reference to economic policies imposed during the Cold War. In Asia, tensions are framed as regional rivalries rather than legacies of imperial partition. The American narrative has taught that history explains the past, not the present. This separation allows Americans to treat current global suffering as tragedy rather than consequence. Tragedy invites sympathy. Consequence invites responsibility. World history, according to Americans, tends to prefer sympathy. This preference is not accidental. Sympathy preserves moral innocence. Responsibility demands reckoning. The narrative also shapes how Americans understand power. Because American history is framed as reluctant leadership, power feels burdensome rather than advantageous. Military bases are framed as protection. Economic dominance is framed as innovation. Cultural influence is framed as inspiration. The idea that power can be structural, that it can shape options before choices are ever made, is harder to see from within this narrative. Structural power does not announce itself. It operates quietly, shaping what feels possible. World history, as taught in the United States, rarely foregrounds structure. It foregrounds events. Wars begin and end. Empires rise and fall. Movements succeed or fail. Structures, trade regimes, financial systems, legal norms appear as background conditions rather than as agents. This event-centered storytelling reinforces the idea that history is made through decisive moments rather than through accumulation. But accumulation is where power actually lives. The accumulation of capital, the accumulation of debt, the accumulation of advantage. These processes unfold slowly and unevenly. They are difficult to dramatize. They do not fit neatly into chapters, and so they are often sidelined. This has consequences for how Americans imagine solutions. If problems arise from bad decisions or failed leadership, then better decisions and better leaders will fix them. If problems arise from deep structural imbalance, then solutions require redistribution, reform, and restraint, ideas that challenge the narrative of earned dominance. World history, according to Americans, tends to support the former interpretation. This is why American responses to global crises often oscillate between intervention and withdrawal. When engagement fails, it feels like meddling. When withdrawal fails, it feels like abandonment. The underlying assumption that the United States is an external actor rather than a structural participant remains intact. The narrative does not prepare Americans to see themselves as part of the problem because it has taught them they are part of the solution. Even when mistakes are acknowledged, they are framed as misapplications of good intent rather than as predictable outcomes of unequal power. Vietnam was a mistake. Iraq was a mistake. But the system that produced those interventions remains unquestioned. History becomes a series of lessons about caution, not about structure. This pattern is reinforced by how success is remembered. When interventions appear to work, post-war Europe, for example, they are cited as proof of benevolence and competence. The unique conditions that made such outcomes possible are rarely emphasized. Instead, success becomes evidence of character. America helped rebuild. America stabilized. The fact that Europe already had strong institutions, skilled labor, and social cohesion is secondary. The narrative centers agency, not context. This selective memory reinforces confidence. Confidence, in turn, shapes future choices. World history, according to Americans, thus becomes a feedback loop. The past justifies the present confirms the past. Alternative interpretations struggle to gain traction because they disrupt coherence, and coherence is comforting. It provides a sense of order in a complex world. It allows Americans to feel oriented rather than overwhelmed. It offers a moral map with clear centers and peripheries. But that comfort comes at the cost of depth. Depth requires holding multiple truths at once. It requires acknowledging that progress for some has meant loss for others. It requires accepting that modernity did not emerge cleanly or evenly. It requires recognizing that the world was not waiting. The American narrative, as commonly taught, resists this multiplicity. It simplifies in order to function. That simplification becomes most visible when Americans encounter other versions of world history, versions that do not place the United States at the center or even at the margin of virtue. These encounters often feel jarring. Why are we blamed? Why are our actions interpreted so differently? Why is our role questioned? The confusion arises not from malice, but from mismatch. Different histories produce different moral landscapes. In one landscape, America is the inheritor of Enlightenment ideals, struggling imperfectly to apply them globally. In another, America is a late-arriving empire, benefiting from systems it did not create but chose to maintain. Both interpretations can coexist, but the American classroom narrative tends to privilege the former. This privilege shapes not only how Americans see the world, but how they see themselves. World history becomes identity. It reassures Americans that their position is not arbitrary, that it has been earned through struggle, innovation, and sacrifice. That leadership is a responsibility thrust upon them by history rather than a condition they must interrogate. To question this narrative feels, to many, like questioning legitimacy itself, and that is why the story persists. Not because it is imposed, but because it is useful. It provides coherence in a fragmented world. It offers moral clarity amid ambiguity. It sustains confidence under scrutiny. But usefulness is not the same as completeness. To move beyond this narrative does not require abandoning it. It requires expanding it, allowing other timelines to run alongside it, other centers to exist, other endpoints to matter. That expansion is uncomfortable because it destabilizes orientation. It replaces a single arc with many intersecting ones. It demands patience rather than resolution. And yet, without that expansion, world history remains provincial even when it claims universality. The American version of world history tells us a great deal about America. What it tells us about the world is more limited. Understanding that difference is the first step toward a more honest global history, one that does not begin with arrival, does not end with validation, and does not assume that the present was inevitable. That work requires turning the narrative outward, not asking how the world led to America, but how America entered a world already in motion. That shift changes everything. And it is where this story must go next. To turn the narrative outward is to undo a habit learned so early that it feels like instinct. It requires beginning without arrival. In most American tellings of world history, the moment of arrival, 1492, 1776, 1917, 1941, anchors the story. Before that moment, history is gathering force. After it, history makes sense. Turning the narrative outward means refusing that anchor. It means starting from places where America is not yet visible, not yet relevant, not yet necessary. And when we do that, the shape of the past changes immediately. The world no longer looks like a stage waiting for a lead actor. It looks crowded, busy, contested, full of trajectories already underway, many of which never converge with the American one at all. Long before European ships crossed the Atlantic, the Indian Ocean world was already integrated by trade, law, religion, and language. Merchants moved from East Africa to Southeast Asia. Islamic legal systems governed contracts across continents. Chinese bureaucratic states administered populations larger than all of Europe combined. Indigenous American societies managed ecosystems with sophistication unmatched by later colonizers. None of this exists in the American narrative as a present. It exists as background. Turning the narrative outward restores simultaneity. It insists that history was happening everywhere at once, not waiting its turn. This simultaneity disrupts the logic of inevitability. if multiple societies were already grappling with governance, inequality, belief, technology, and environment in their own ways, then modernity stops looking like a destination and starts looking like a divergence. One path among many, chosen, contested, enforced. From this perspective, Europe's rise is no longer the natural outcome of superior ideas. It becomes a historically contingent result of geography, disease, internal conflict, and external extraction. America's rise, in turn, becomes an extension of that contingency rather than its culmination. This reframing does not diminish American achievement. It contextualizes it. Context is what the American narrative often lacks, not because it is hidden, but because it is inconvenient. Context reveals that power accumulates unevenly, that advantage compounds, that early access to resources and global networks reshapes possibilities long before anyone speaks of merit or innovation. When American history is told inward, it feels earned. When told outward, it feels situated. That difference matters deeply, because a situated history produces humility. It acknowledges that outcomes could have been different, that other futures were possible, that present dominance is not proof of destiny. Humility is not weakness. It is clarity. But clarity is difficult to maintain in a national narrative, especially one taught to children. National histories exist to bind, not to destabilize. They create shared reference points. They offer continuity. They produce loyalty. World history, as taught in American classrooms, performs a similar function at a larger scale. It binds Americans to a global story that makes sense of their power without interrogating it too deeply. This is why turning the narrative outward often meets resistance. It feels like erosion, like relativism, like loss of moral footing. But what is actually being lost is not morality, but monopoly. A monopoly on interpretation. When American world history is treated as the world history, alternative perspectives appear as challenges rather than complements. They are framed as political, ideological, or revisionist rather than as necessary correctives. Yet every global history written from somewhere else already assumes America as one actor among many. In Chinese historical education, American history appears late and briefly. In Indian narratives, America enters primarily through Cold War alignment and globalization. In African histories, America appears as a distant power influencing outcomes without deep understanding of local conditions. None of these narratives deny American influence. They simply refuse to center it. The shock Americans sometimes feel when encountering these perspectives reveals how deeply centered their own narrative has been. Why are we barely mentioned? Why do they remember us this way? The answer is simple and uncomfortable, because history looks different from different places. World history, according to Americans, often assumes that difference equals bias, but difference is inevitable. The question is not whether perspective exists, but whether it is acknowledged. Acknowledging perspective changes how events are interpreted. Take the Cold War. In the American telling, it is a global struggle between freedom and authoritarianism, with the United States acting to contain a hostile ideology. In outward-looking narratives, the Cold War is often remembered as an era in which newly independent nations were forced into binary choices that disrupted fragile political systems. The same events exist. The framing shifts. Or take globalization. In American narratives, globalization is the spread of markets, technology, and opportunity. In many other narratives, it is remembered as exposure, sudden competition, cultural erosion, economic vulnerability. Again, the facts do not change. The center does. Turning the narrative outward does not require rejecting American values. It requires accepting that those values have not been universally experienced as liberating. This acceptance is difficult because it destabilizes the moral clarity the American narrative provides. It introduces ambiguity where certainty once lived, but ambiguity is not confusion. It is realism. World history, when told honestly, is ambiguous. Progress and exploitation coexist. Innovation and violence intertwine. Freedom for some is built on constraint for others. The American narrative often separates these elements into different chapters. Turning the narrative outward forces them into the same frame. This integrated view helps explain why global reactions to American power are so varied, why admiration and resentment coexist, why intervention is welcomed by some and feared by others, why American intentions are questioned even when stated clearly. These reactions are not misunderstandings, they are historically grounded responses shaped by different experiences of the same global systems. Understanding this does not weaken American identity, it matures it. A mature historical identity can hold contradiction without collapsing. It can acknowledge benefit without denying harm. It can recognize influence without assuming virtue. But such maturity requires rethinking what world history is for. Is it meant to reassure, or is it meant to explain? American world history, as commonly taught, prioritizes reassurance. It offers a story in which the present makes sense, the past leads somewhere meaningful, and the future feels manageable. An outward-facing world history prioritizes explanation. It does not guarantee comfort. It does not promise resolution. It reveals entanglement. Entanglement is harder to teach. It resists clean arcs. It frustrates closure. It demands patience and humility. But entanglement is what global history actually is. The world has never moved in one direction. It has moved in many, colliding and diverging. Power has shifted. Systems have overlapped. No single narrative can contain it fully. The American version of world history is one thread in this larger fabric. It is not wrong. It is partial. Recognizing that partiality is not an accusation. It is an invitation. An invitation to expand the story rather than defend it, to add voices rather than replace them, to see the world not as a road that led somewhere, but as a terrain crossed by many paths. When Americans begin to see world history this way, their relationship to the world changes. Global events stop feeling like interruptions to a stable order and start feeling like continuations of long processes. Other societies stop appearing as problems to be solved and start appearing as histories in motion. This shift does not come easily. It challenges deeply held assumptions about leadership, responsibility, and inevitability. But without it, world history remains confined, large in scope, but narrow in vision. The final question, then, is not whether Americans should abandon their version of world history. It is whether they are willing to see it as a version at all. Because the moment that happens, the story does not shrink. It grows. And in that growth, world history becomes what it has always been. Not a path toward a destination, but a conversation among many pasts, still unfolding, still unfinished. That conversation does not end with America. America enters it, late, powerfully, consequentially, but never alone. And understanding that may be the most important historical lesson of all. If that realization takes hold, if Americans begin to see their version of world history as one narrative among many rather than the narrative, then the meaning of history itself begins to change. History stops functioning as validation and starts functioning as orientation. Validation tells you that where you stand is justified. Orientation tells you where you are, how you arrived there, and what else exists around you. World history, according to Americans, has long prioritized validation. It reassures a nation about its place in the world by organizing the past into a story that leads, however unevenly, toward American power and influence. This is why the narrative feels coherent even when it is incomplete. Coherence is its purpose, but orientation requires something different. It requires acknowledging disjunctions, ruptures, and asymmetries that do not resolve neatly. It requires accepting that the present is not the natural endpoint of the past, but one configuration among many possible ones. This is difficult precisely because the American narrative has been so successful. Success produces confidence. Confidence resists revision. When a society is powerful, its stories feel confirmed by reality. If the world looks the way the story says it should, why question the story? This feedback loop is subtle but strong. Power makes narrative feel true. Yet history is filled with moments when dominant narratives felt self-evident until they didn't. European empires once told global histories that placed themselves at the center, justified conquest as civilizing, and framed resistance as backwardness. Those narratives were coherent, widely taught, and deeply believed. They collapsed not because they were obviously false, but because the world they described changed. The American narrative has not yet faced that kind of reckoning. Its moment of dominance is still recent. Its institutions still shape global discourse. Its language still defines international norms. But cracks appear when the narrative encounters experiences it cannot easily absorb. Why do some societies reject American-led globalization even when it promises growth? Why do democratic institutions fail to take root where they are introduced? Why does resentment persist long after formal colonialism ends? These questions cannot be answered by reference to culture alone. They require history that is not centered on American arrival or intention. They require history that takes seriously what came before, what was disrupted, and what continues beneath the surface. This is where American world history often falters, not because it lacks information, but because it lacks proportion. Proportion determines what feels causal and what feels incidental. In American narratives, ideas often feel causal. Enlightenment thought leads to revolution. Democracy leads to prosperity. Free markets lead to growth. Material conditions, land dispossession, labor extraction, environmental transformation often feel incidental. They appear as background factors rather than driving forces. This imbalance reflects American political culture, which privileges ideology and individual agency over structure. It also reflects how history is taught, through speeches, documents, and turning points rather than through flows, accumulations, and constraints. As a result, American world history often struggles to explain why good ideas fail. If democracy is inherently stabilizing, why does it collapse? If markets produce prosperity, why does inequality persist? If freedom is universal, why is it resisted? The answers usually return to implementation, corruption, poor leadership, insufficient education. These explanations keep the core narrative intact. An outward-looking world history offers a different approach. It asks not only whether ideas are good, but whether conditions allow them to function. It treats political forms as embedded in material realities rather than as transferable templates. From this perspective, American success becomes less mysterious and less moralized. It is not the result of superior values alone, but of specific historical advantages, geographic isolation, resource abundance, demographic growth, delayed state formation, and relative insulation from repeated invasion. These advantages do not negate American ideals. They contextualize their viability. This contextualization is what American world history rarely provides, not because it is hidden, but because it complicates the narrative of earned leadership. Earned leadership feels secure. Situated leadership feels fragile. Yet fragility is historically accurate. No society's dominance is permanent. No narrative remains unchallenged forever. The only question is whether adjustment comes through reflection or through crisis. History education plays a role in that choice. If Americans are taught world history as a settled story, one that explains why the present looks as it does and why it should continue that way, then challenges feel illegitimate. They provoke defensiveness rather than inquiry. If Americans are taught world history as an unfinished conversation, one that includes their own society as a participant rather than a conclusion, then challenges feel intelligible, even when uncomfortable. This distinction matters because the world Americans inhabit now is no longer one where their narrative goes uncontested. Other powers tell different stories. Other societies remember different pasts. Other populations interpret American actions through frameworks shaped by their own histories, not by American textbooks. When these narratives collide, misunderstanding follows. American leaders may speak in the language of stability while others hear dominance. American institutions may speak in the language of order while others hear control. American interventions may be framed as support while others experience disruption. These misalignments are not failures of communication. They are failures of historical translation. Translation requires awareness of perspective. World history, according to Americans, often assumes that its language is universal, that its categories, freedom, democracy, development, security, mean the same thing everywhere. But meanings are shaped by experience. Freedom experienced as liberation feels different from freedom experienced as exposure. Security provided by distant power feels different from security built locally. Development imposed rapidly feels different from development grown slowly. These differences are historical, not rhetorical. Without acknowledging them, American engagement with the world risks repeating a familiar pattern, acting with confidence while misunderstanding impact. The irony is that American history itself offers warnings about this dynamic. The American Revolution emerged from resentment toward distant authority. The American frontier was shaped by resistance to imposed systems. American political culture valorizes local control and suspicion of centralized power. These experiences could foster empathy for other societies navigating external pressure. Yet the world history narrative often isolates American experience rather than connecting it. America becomes the exception, not the example. An outward-facing world history would reverse this. It would place American experience within a broader human pattern rather than above it. It would show that Americans, too, have been shaped by forces beyond their control, by inherited structures, by global currents. This does not diminish agency, it situates it. And situating agency is the heart of historical understanding. History is not a courtroom where innocence or guilt is assigned. It is a map of constraints and possibilities. It shows what options existed, which were taken, and what followed. World history, according to Americans, often functions as a moral narrative. It distinguishes right from wrong, progress from failure. That has value. Moral frameworks matter. But without structural awareness, morality becomes self-referential. It judges others by standards whose origins it does not examine. Structural awareness does not excuse injustice. It explains persistence. It explains why inequality reproduces, why resentment endures, why conflict reappears in familiar forms. These patterns are not mysteries. They are legacies. To teach world history without legacies is to teach effect without cause. The American narrative includes causes, but often selects those that align with identity. It foregrounds ideals, intentions, and choices. It backgrounds constraints, asymmetries, and inherited advantage. This selectivity is not unique to America. What makes it consequential is scale. When the most influential society tells a partial story as though it were complete, the world must respond, not only to its power, but to its misunderstanding. And misunderstanding is dangerous. It leads to overconfidence. It leads to miscalculation. It leads to surprise when outcomes diverge from expectation. History education cannot prevent these dangers entirely, but it can reduce them. A world history that treats America as one actor among many, emerging from specific conditions rather than destiny, produces citizens more capable of interpreting global complexity. Such citizens may still disagree. They may still defend national interests. But they do so with awareness rather than assumption. That awareness does not weaken national identity. It strengthens it by making it flexible rather than brittle. A brittle identity breaks under pressure. A flexible one adapts. World history, when taught honestly, trains flexibility. It teaches that dominance is temporary, that progress is uneven, that ideas travel differently than armies, that power creates responsibility whether intended or not. These lessons are not comfortable. They do not offer closure. They resist triumph. But they offer something more valuable: realism. And realism is what the American narrative now needs most. Not to abandon its story, but to expand it beyond reassurance. Not to erase pride, but to ground it. Not to silence ideals, but to test them against history as it was actually lived by many peoples, in many places at the same time. World history, according to Americans, has long been a mirror, reflecting a nation's self-understanding back to itself. The next step is to let it become a window onto a world that was never waiting, a world already in motion, a world in which America is powerful, influential, and consequential, but never alone. When that window opens, history does not disappear. It becomes deeper, and the story, finally, becomes large enough to hold the world it claims to describe. When that window opens, something subtle but profound happens to the role of the United States in the story. America stops being the destination of history and becomes one of its intersections. This shift changes not only how the past is understood, but how responsibility is imagined. Because when a nation sees itself as the end point of a long historical arc, its task is preservation. It must defend what has been achieved. It must protect the culmination. Any challenge feels like regression. But when a nation understands itself as an intersection, formed by forces it did not fully control, benefiting from paths it did not solely create, its task becomes navigation. Navigation requires awareness of currents. World history, according to Americans, has often emphasized steering, leadership, guidance, direction. What it has emphasized less is drift, the ways in which global systems move independently of intention, carrying nations along even as they attempt to command outcomes. Consider capitalism. In American narratives, capitalism is usually framed as an engine of innovation and freedom. It is tied to individual initiative, entrepreneurship, and growth. Its darker aspects, exploitation, inequality, environmental cost, are acknowledged but often treated as correctable flaws rather than structural features. From an outward-looking historical perspective, capitalism appears differently. It emerges not simply from ideas about markets, but from conquest, enclosure, coerced labor, and global extraction. It does not spread evenly, it produces centers and peripheries, it rewards early entrants and penalizes late ones. When Americans learn world history inwardly, capitalism feels like a choice. When learned outwardly, it feels like a condition, one that shapes options long before choice enters the picture. This difference matters because it alters how responsibility is assigned. If outcomes are chosen, blame attaches to decisions. If outcomes are conditioned, responsibility attaches to systems. World history, according to Americans, tends to privilege the former. It narrates the rise of global systems as the sum of decisions made by identifiable actors, explorers, inventors, leaders. Structural forces appear as consequences, not as drivers, but systems, once established, generate momentum. They shape what later actors can and cannot do. They constrain even the powerful. The American narrative rarely dwells on this constraint because it complicates the image of agency. It suggests that American leaders, too, are shaped by forces they do not fully command. And yet, this is historically accurate. The United States did not invent the global order alone. It inherited, modified, and extended systems built by earlier empires. Its power rests not only on ideals, but on institutions, networks, and advantages accumulated over centuries. Acknowledging this does not negate American influence. It clarifies it. Influence exercised within a system is different from influence exercised over a system. The former is more limited, more fragile, and more ethically complex. World history, according to Americans, often implies the latter. This implication becomes most visible in moments of frustration, when outcomes diverge sharply from intention. Why didn't democracy take root? Why did intervention backfire? Why did globalization produce backlash? These questions arise because the narrative prepared Americans to expect alignment between intent and outcome. When alignment fails, the explanation often returns to others' failures rather than to systemic inertia. An outward-looking history reframes these moments. It shows that global systems often produce outcomes regardless of intent, that interventions interact with local histories in unpredictable ways. That power exercised through existing structures amplifies some effects while muting others. This perspective does not absolve responsibility. It deepens it. Responsibility, in this sense, is not only about making good choices. It is about understanding the terrain on which choices operate. That understanding begins with history, taught as entanglement rather than ascent. Entanglement means that no society's history can be told cleanly. Paths cross. Advantages are borrowed. Harms spill over. Gains in one place correspond to losses elsewhere. The American narrative often acknowledges entanglement rhetorically, through phrases like a connected world or globalization, but rarely structurally. Entanglement is treated as a modern condition rather than as a long-standing reality. In truth, the world has been entangled for centuries. What changes is who benefits most from that entanglement. When Americans learn world history as a sequence leading toward their own society, entanglement feels like a recent complication. When they learn it outwardly, entanglement appears foundational. This difference shapes how Americans respond to global responsibility. If entanglement is new, responsibility feels optional. If entanglement is old, responsibility feels inherited. Inherited responsibility is harder to accept because it cannot be traced to a single decision. It is diffuse, cumulative, and impersonal. World history, according to Americans, tends to resist impersonal causation. It prefers stories with protagonists. Protagonists are easier to judge. Systems are harder to confront. Yet systems are where the deepest historical forces reside. Take borders. In American world history, Borders often appear as natural outcomes, lines drawn after wars, treaties signed, nations formed. Their arbitrariness is acknowledged, but their consequences are often treated as local problems. In outward-looking histories, borders are remembered as impositions that reshaped identities, economies, and conflicts for generations. They are not just lines, they are legacies. The difference between these perspectives is not factual, it is experiential. For Americans, borders are distant abstractions. For others, they are lived constraints. This asymmetry repeats across themes: debt, trade, migration, security. American narratives often treat these as policy issues. Outward narratives treat them as historical conditions. Conditions shape lives more deeply than policies. Understanding this requires a different historical sensibility, one that does not ask first what America did, but what global structures were already doing when America entered the scene. That sensibility changes how events are framed. The Marshall Plan, for example, appears in American history as generosity and foresight. In outward-looking history, it also appears as strategic reconstruction of a specific region under conditions not extended elsewhere. Both are true, but the second truth complicates the first. Similarly, American support for certain regimes appears in American narratives as pragmatic choices under pressure. In outward narratives, those choices appear as decisive interventions that shaped decades of repression or instability. Again, both are true. World history, according to Americans, often prefers the version that preserves moral coherence. Moral coherence is valuable, but when it overrides explanatory power, it becomes brittle. A brittle narrative cannot absorb contradiction. It reacts defensively when challenged. It treats alternative histories as accusations rather than as perspectives. An outward-facing narrative does the opposite. It expects contradiction. It anticipates disagreement. It treats history as a field of overlapping truths rather than a verdict. This does not mean abandoning judgment. It means postponing it long enough to understand context. Context does not excuse injustice. It reveals how injustice persists. The American narrative often emphasizes moments when injustice is corrected: abolition, civil rights, reform. These are rightly celebrated. But outward-looking histories emphasize moments when injustice is institutionalized through trade regimes, debt structures, military alliances. Both moments matter, but they tell different stories about how change occurs. In the American telling, change often arrives through moral awakening. In outward tellings, change often arrives through exhaustion, collapse, or reconfiguration of power. Moral awakening is inspiring, structural exhaustion is sobering. World history taught inwardly prefers inspiration. World history taught outwardly insists on sobriety. Sobriety is not pessimism, it is realism stripped of reassurance. And realism is increasingly necessary in a world where American dominance is no longer uncontested, where other narratives assert themselves with confidence, and where global challenges, climate, migration, inequality, cannot be addressed through unilateral frameworks. World history, according to Americans, prepared a society for leadership in a particular historical moment. That moment is changing. The question now is whether the narrative can change with it, because history does not ask permission before shifting its center of gravity. It simply does. And societies that understand this early adjust. Those that cling to inherited stories too tightly are surprised. The American story of world history has been powerful, coherent, and persuasive. Its next test is whether it can become capacious enough to include other pasts without defensiveness, capacious enough to accept responsibility without moral collapse. capacious enough to see America not as history's destination, but as one of its most consequential participants. That shift does not diminish the story. It makes it truer, and a truer history, one that accepts complexity rather than resisting it, does not weaken a society. It prepares it, because in the end, world history is not about where the world was going. It is about how people navigated uncertainty, power, and consequence as they moved through time together. America is part of that story, not the end of it, not the center of it, but undeniably within it. And learning to tell that story honestly may be the most important historical task Americans now face. To face that task honestly is to accept a final, uncomfortable implication of the American version of world history. It was never designed to explain the world as it is. It was designed to explain America to itself. This is not an accusation. It is a function. Every national history does this. It selects, orders, and emphasizes the past in ways that stabilize identity. It answers a quiet question beneath every lesson. Who are we, and how did we get here? World history, when filtered through a national lens, becomes an extension of that inquiry. In the United States, that inquiry has always been shaped by scale. America is large, geographically insulated, and historically young as a state. Its foundational myths emphasize beginnings rather than inheritances, choices rather than constraints. The frontier, the revolution, the Constitution, these are stories of deliberate action, of agency exercised against limitation. When Americans tell world history, they project this same logic outward. The world becomes a sequence of choices. Nations succeed or fail based on decisions. History rewards innovation and punishes stagnation. This framing feels intuitive because it mirrors how Americans are taught to understand their own past. But the world does not experience history primarily as choice. It experiences it as inheritance. Inheritance of borders, inheritance of debt, inheritance of ecological damage, inheritance of political systems imposed or distorted long before living generations had any say. World history, according to Americans, often underplays inheritance because it complicates responsibility. Inheritance implies obligation without consent. It suggests that one can benefit from systems one did not design and suffer from systems one did not choose. This idea sits uneasily with a political culture built around consent and individual agency, and yet inheritance is one of history's most powerful forces. Most people are born into worlds whose rules were written before they arrived. They navigate structures they did not build. They inherit advantages or disadvantages that shape their options long before they exercise choice. An outward-facing world history places inheritance at the center. An inward-facing one treats it as background. This difference shapes moral imagination. If outcomes are chosen, responsibility lies with the chooser. If outcomes are inherited, responsibility lies with the system, and with those who benefit from maintaining it. World history, according to Americans, often stops short of this second implication. It acknowledges that the world is unequal, but it frames inequality as a problem to be fixed rather than as a condition produced by history. It emphasizes aid, development, and reform without fully reckoning with how deeply current arrangements are rooted in past extraction and asymmetry. This framing keeps hope alive. It also keeps accountability diffuse. Hope is valuable, but hope untethered from history becomes impatience. It expects results without fully understanding constraints. This impatience surfaces again and again in American engagement with the world. Why hasn't this worked yet? Why are they still struggling? Why can't they move forward? These questions assume that forward motion is available if only the right choices are made. They underestimate how heavy history can be. World history, taught honestly, teaches weight. It teaches that some societies carry centuries of accumulated disruption, that some institutions were built to extract, not to serve, that some borders were drawn to divide, not to govern, that some economies were designed to depend, not to develop. These realities do not excuse failure. They contextualize difficulty. American world history often treats difficulty as deviation from a norm. Outward-facing history treats difficulty as the norm itself. This difference matters most when history turns into policy. Policy operates on assumptions about what is possible, what is normal, what is reasonable. If those assumptions are shaped by a simplified history, policy will misjudge both risk and consequence. The 20th century offers repeated examples of this mismatch. Interventions launched with confidence in quick stabilization, reforms imposed with confidence in institutional transfer, markets opened with confidence in inevitable growth. When outcomes diverged, the explanation often returned to local failure rather than historical burden. This pattern is not uniquely American, but American power magnifies its consequences. World history, according to Americans, prepared a society to act in the world. It did not prepare it to be entangled in the world. Entanglement means that action creates feedback. That intervention reshapes the actor as well as the target. That influence generates obligation beyond intention. These are difficult lessons for any powerful society. They are especially difficult for one whose historical narrative emphasizes moral clarity and decisive agency. And yet, the American past itself contains examples of entanglement that could have informed a different narrative. The legacy of slavery, the persistence of racial inequality, the long afterlife of dispossession. These are instances where the past did not stay past, where inherited structures shaped present realities long after formal change occurred. American domestic history increasingly acknowledges this. Global history has been slower to follow. The separation between our history and world history allows Americans to recognize inheritance at home while overlooking it abroad. This separation is artificial. The same forces that shaped domestic inequality, extraction, exclusion, accumulated advantage, shaped global inequality as well. They operated at different scales, but through similar mechanisms. An outward-facing world history makes this visible. It reveals that American prosperity is not only the product of internal virtues, but of a global position forged through historical processes that advantaged some and constrained others. This recognition does not demand guilt. It demands realism. Realism allows for responsibility without moral collapse. It allows a society to act without illusion. It allows engagement without surprise. Most importantly, it allows history to function as a guide rather than as a shield. World history, according to Americans, has often functioned as a shield, protecting identity, justifying power, simplifying complexity. The next version of that history must function as a compass. A compass does not tell you where you deserve to be. It tells you where you are and how terrain shifts. The terrain of the 21st century is shifting rapidly. Power is diffusing, narratives are multiplying, memory is contested. History is no longer told from one center. In this environment, the ability to recognize one's own narrative as partial is not weakness. It is adaptability. Adaptability has always been the true measure of historical survival. Empires fall not because they are challenged, but because they cannot revise their self-understanding fast enough to respond to change. The American narrative of world history does not need to be discarded. It needs to be uncentered. Uncentering does not erase influence, it contextualizes it. It allows Americans to see themselves not as the authors of the global story, but as characters within it, powerful ones, consequential ones, but still shaped by forces larger than intention. This is the final, quiet lesson hidden within world history itself. No society writes the final chapter. No narrative remains uncontested. No present explains the past fully. History continues not toward destinations, but through interactions. The American story is one of those interactions. It matters. It has mattered immensely. It will continue to matter, but it will matter most if it is told alongside others rather than above them. World history, according to Americans, began as a way of making sense of a vast and unfamiliar world. Its future lies in learning to share that world with histories that do not revolve around American arrival, leadership, or validation. That sharing does not diminish the story. It completes it, because the world was never a road leading somewhere. It was always a crowded crossing. And America, like everyone else, arrived there mid-journey, carrying a past, shaping a present, and moving forward without guarantees. That is not a loss of meaning. It is the beginning of historical maturity. Historical maturity does not arrive with a revelation. It arrives with restraint. It arrives when a society learns to pause before explaining the world to itself, and instead listens for how the world has been explaining itself all along. For Americans, this pause is difficult precisely because the old narrative has worked. It has produced coherence, confidence, and a sense of purpose. It has aligned national identity with global meaning. But coherence is not the same as accuracy. World history, according to Americans, has long been a story that runs smoothly because its roughest edges have been sanded down. The contradictions are acknowledged but compartmentalized. The harms are named but isolated. The benefits are universalized, while the costs are localized. This produces a powerful emotional effect. Americans learn to feel responsible for the world without feeling implicated in it. Responsibility implies action. Implication implies accountability. The narrative favors the first. This distinction becomes especially clear when Americans encounter global criticism. When policies are opposed, when intentions are questioned, when historical grievances resurface, the instinctive response is often confusion rather than reflection. Why are they angry? Why do they distrust us? Why do they remember it that way? These questions reveal a gap between how Americans remember the past and how others live with it. World history, as taught in the United States, often treats memory as settled. Events are archived, lessons extracted, chapters closed. Other societies experience memory as open, unresolved, and active. Colonialism is not past in Africa. Partition is not past in South Asia. Dictatorship is not past in Latin America. These histories are not remembered as episodes. They are lived as conditions. The American narrative, by contrast, tends to move on quickly. Closure is valued. Progress requires forward motion. Dwelling feels unproductive. This cultural orientation shapes historical storytelling. When Americans teach world history, they emphasize transitions, from empire to nation-state, from tradition to modernity, from conflict to stability. The emphasis is on what comes next. But many societies experience history as accumulation rather than transition. The past does not clear space for the future. It crowds it. This difference in historical experience produces different political instincts. Americans often ask how to move forward. Others ask how to live with what remains. Neither question is wrong, but they require different kinds of historical understanding. World history, according to Americans, prepares citizens to think in terms of solutions. Outward-facing world history prepares them to think in terms of constraints. Solutions are appealing. Constraints are sobering. The preference for solutions explains why American narratives often highlight moments of reform and reconciliation. Abolition, Reconstruction, civil rights. These are framed as evidence that injustice can be overcome through moral struggle. These narratives are powerful and necessary within American history, but when exported globally, they can distort understanding. They suggest that historical wounds heal on predictable timelines. That acknowledgement leads to closure, that progress, once achieved, is durable. For many societies, this has not been the case. Acknowledgement did not restore land. Independence did not restore economies. Revolution did not restore stability. The expectation of resolution becomes another source of misunderstanding. World history, according to Americans, often assumes that the past explains itself if given enough time. Outward-facing history suggests that time alone does not resolve injustice. It often entrenches it. This is where the American narrative's optimism collides with global experience. Optimism is one of America's defining traits. It fuels innovation, risk-taking, and reform. In historical storytelling, it manifests as faith in progress. But faith in progress can become blindness to persistence, persistent inequality, persistent resentment, persistent imbalance. These are not failures of will, they are legacies of structure. World history taught as ascent struggles to account for persistence. It expects improvement. When improvement does not arrive, it searches for culprits. World history taught as entanglement expects persistence. It asks how structures reproduce themselves, how advantage compounds, how harm echoes. This shift in expectation changes how blame is assigned. Instead of asking who failed, it asks what endured. Instead of asking what went wrong, it asks what was built that way. Instead of asking how to fix, it asks how to dismantle. These are harder questions. They resist quick answers. They demand patience and humility. They also demand a different relationship to power. American world history often treats power as a tool, something wielded for good or ill, depending on intention. Outward-facing history treats power as an environment, something that shapes behavior regardless of intent. This distinction is crucial. If power is a tool, then moral intent is paramount. If power is an environment, then structure matters more than intent. The American narrative tends to emphasize the former. This is why it struggles to explain why well-intentioned actions produce harmful outcomes. Intent does not cancel structure. Goodwill does not erase asymmetry. World history, when taught outwardly, makes this clear. It shows that empires often believed themselves benevolent, that administrators often believed they were modernizing, that interventions were often framed as rescue. And yet, harm followed, not because of hypocrisy alone, but because power itself distorts. This lesson is uncomfortable because it implicates even the virtuous. It suggests that one can cause harm without malice, that one can benefit without deserving, that one can inherit responsibility without choosing it. World history, according to Americans, has not prepared citizens to sit with these truths for long. It prefers narratives where virtue eventually triumphs and guilt can be resolved, but the world does not resolve so neatly. Historical maturity means accepting that some legacies cannot be undone quickly, that some benefits cannot be disentangled cleanly, and that some responsibilities persist regardless of intent. This acceptance does not paralyze action. It refines it. Action informed by historical realism is slower, more cautious, and more attentive to unintended consequences. It listens longer. It intervenes less confidently. It prioritizes partnership over leadership. Such action is less dramatic. It does not fit easily into heroic narratives. It rarely produces clear victories, but it produces fewer surprises. World history, according to Americans, has often privileged clarity over caution. It has celebrated decisive moments rather than sustained processes. It has taught generations to expect history to move in recognizable arcs. The world Americans inhabit now does not move that way. Power is fragmented, crises overlap, causes are layered, solutions are partial. In this environment, the old narrative offers diminishing returns. It explains too little. It reassures too much. It prepares poorly for complexity. The task now is not to replace it with a story of guilt or decline. That would simply invert the moral axis without deepening understanding. The task is to tell a story capacious enough to hold contradiction. A story in which America is neither savior nor villain, but participant. A story in which progress exists, but unevenly. A story in which history does not culminate, but continues. This is not a call for self-denial. It is a call for proportion. Proportion allows pride without arrogance. Proportion allows responsibility without paralysis. Proportion allows memory without myth. World history, told with proportion, becomes a discipline rather than a narrative. It trains judgment rather than loyalty. It prepares citizens not to win arguments about the past, but to navigate a world shaped by it. That is what world history should do, not tell Americans who they are, but help them understand where they are, because where they are is not at the end of a story. It is in the middle of one. A story shared with billions of others, each carrying their own pasts, their own memories, their own versions of how the world came to be this way. Learning to live among those stories, without needing one to dominate, is the real challenge of historical maturity, and it is a challenge no society can avoid forever. The American story of world history has been powerful precisely because it made sense of power. The next version must make sense of limits. That shift does not signal decline. It signals awareness. And awareness, more than certainty, is what history ultimately demands from those who inherit its weight. Awareness, once it begins, rarely announces itself with certainty. It emerges quietly, through friction, through moments when inherited explanations no longer fit the world as it is encountered. For Americans, those moments are increasingly common. A war framed as liberation leaves behind instability. An intervention framed as protection generates resentment. A global system framed as opportunity deepens inequality. Each time this happens, the old historical narrative strains. It does not collapse, but it creaks. The explanations still exist, but they feel thinner. The confidence that once accompanied them gives way to defensiveness or confusion. Why didn't this work? Why do they see us that way? Why is the world not behaving as expected? These questions are not failures of intelligence. They are symptoms of a historical framework reaching its limits. World history, according to Americans, has long functioned as a map. It showed where danger lay, where progress flowed, where responsibility rested. It oriented Americans in a complex world by simplifying that world into something navigable. But maps age. They reflect the assumptions of the moment they were drawn. They emphasize certain routes and ignore others. They flatten terrain to make travel possible. When the terrain changes, the map does not suddenly become malicious. It becomes insufficient. This is where Americans now find themselves, not lost, but navigating with an outdated chart. The global order that once aligned neatly with American historical expectations is fragmenting. Power is diffusing to regions long treated as peripheral. Narratives are multiplying. Memory is becoming contested rather than settled. Countries once framed as developing are asserting alternative models. Populations once treated as beneficiaries are articulating grievances. Institutions once assumed stable are eroding. None of this is unprecedented in world history. What is unprecedented is how directly it confronts a society accustomed to seeing itself as the organizer of global meaning. World history, according to Americans, did not prepare citizens for a world in which their story would be challenged not only by rivals, but by partners, allies, and formerly subordinate voices. It prepared them to lead. It did not prepare them to listen. Listening, in historical terms, means allowing other pasts to retain their force. It means accepting that memory does not converge naturally, that different societies carry different wounds, priorities, and interpretations. This is difficult because it destabilizes moral hierarchy. If multiple histories are valid, then authority is no longer guaranteed by virtue alone. It must be negotiated. It must be contextual. It must be earned repeatedly rather than assumed. World history, according to Americans, has often taught that authority flows from ideals and success. Outward-facing history suggests that authority also flows from trust, and trust is shaped by memory. Memory cannot be reset by intention. When American leaders speak of moving on, others hear erasure. When Americans emphasize the future, others insist on the past. When Americans frame history as lesson learned, others frame it as debt unpaid. These are not semantic disagreements, they are historical ones. The American narrative's emphasis on closure clashes with global experiences of persistence. Closure feels possible when institutions are stable and benefits endure. It feels hollow when disruption continues. This is why apologies, acknowledgments, and symbolic gestures often fall short. They operate within a narrative that assumes the past can be bracketed. For many societies, the past is not behind them, it is around them. World history taught inwardly treats history as something that happened. World history taught outwardly treats it as something that continues to act. This difference reshapes political imagination. If the past is finished, solutions focus on policy. If the past is active, solutions require repair. Repair is slower than reform. It lacks clear endpoints. It demands long-term commitment rather than decisive action. The American narrative, oriented toward solutions, struggles with repair. Repair does not fit easily into heroic frameworks. It requires acknowledging asymmetry without promising resolution. It requires staying engaged without controlling outcomes. And it requires historical patience. Patience is not a virtue often cultivated by narratives of ascent. Ascent teaches momentum. Repair teaches persistence. World history, according to Americans, has celebrated momentum. It has taught that history moves forward through breakthroughs, revolutions, innovations, victories. Outward-facing history teaches that history often moves sideways, backward, or in circles. That progress in one domain coincides with regression in another. That gains are provisional. This is not pessimism. It is proportion. Proportion allows societies to calibrate expectations. It prevents overreach. It tempers disappointment. It encourages humility without surrender. Humility, in this context, does not mean minimizing American influence or responsibility. It means recognizing that influence does not equal omniscience. The American narrative often assumes that with enough information and goodwill, outcomes can be shaped. Outward-facing history suggests that outcomes are shaped by layers of inherited conditions that resist design. This does not render action futile. It renders it conditional. Conditional action is harder to justify publicly. It resists slogans. It demands nuance. It accepts partial success. World history, when taught as complexity rather than culmination, trains citizens to tolerate ambiguity. Ambiguity is uncomfortable. It leaves space for doubt. It frustrates the desire for moral clarity. But ambiguity is where responsible power lives. Power exercised without ambiguity becomes brittle. It mistakes confidence for certainty. It assumes alignment between intent and impact. World history, according to Americans, has often reinforced this assumption. It has taught that good intentions, paired with decisive action, lead to good outcomes. The world has repeatedly demonstrated otherwise. The challenge now is not to abandon intention, but to discipline it with historical understanding. That discipline begins with revising the story Americans tell about the world, not by removing America from the narrative, but by decentering it. Decentering does not mean diminishing importance. It means altering perspective. A decentered narrative places America alongside other actors rather than above them. It allows global systems to take precedence over national virtue. It treats outcomes as relational rather than unilateral. This shift changes how success is defined. Success is no longer measured solely by achievement or dominance. It is measured by sustainability, legitimacy, and resilience. These measures require time. World history, according to Americans, has often been compressed to fit curricula, attention spans, and national priorities. Time has been organized around key moments that reinforce coherence. Outward-facing history stretches time. It insists on long arcs, slow consequences, and delayed effects. Environmental history, for example, complicates the American narrative dramatically. It reveals how industrial success has long-term costs that were invisible to earlier generations. It shows how prosperity in one region produces vulnerability elsewhere. These insights do not fit easily into narratives of triumph, but they are indispensable for understanding the present. Climate change is not an event, it is a legacy, and legacies cannot be managed with event-based thinking. World history, taught as inheritance rather than sequence, prepares citizens for such challenges. It emphasizes stewardship over control. It highlights interdependence over autonomy. Interdependence is another concept that sits uneasily with American historical identity. The national story emphasizes independence, political, economic, cultural. Yet global history reveals that independence has always been partial. Even at its most autonomous moments, America relied on global trade, migration, and resources. Recognizing interdependence does not negate independence. It reframes it as relative rather than absolute. Relative independence is more realistic and more ethical. It acknowledges that choices have ripple effects, that benefits are shared unevenly, that costs are often deferred. World history, according to Americans, has often postponed this reckoning by treating global consequences as secondary. But the present no longer allows that separation. Global crises are no longer distant. They intersect directly with domestic life. Pandemics, supply chains, climate events, migration. These phenomena expose the limits of inward-facing history. They reveal that the world cannot be understood as a backdrop to national action. It is the medium in which action occurs. History, in this context, is not a guide to greatness. It is a guide to survival. Survival requires coordination, empathy, and restraint, qualities cultivated by outward-facing narratives. The American story of world history has long emphasized agency. The next chapter must emphasize relationship. Relationship means recognizing that no society acts alone, that outcomes emerge from interaction, that power is negotiated continuously. This does not eliminate conflict. It contextualizes it. Conflict, seen through outward history, is not a failure of morality, but a collision of legacies. Understanding those legacies does not solve conflict. It prevents misdiagnosis. Misdiagnosis is one of the greatest dangers of simplified history. It leads societies to treat symptoms rather than causes, to repeat interventions rather than reconsider frameworks. World history, taught as complexity, resists misdiagnosis. It teaches that answers require time, that patience is strategic, that listening is an action. These lessons do not promise comfort. They promise relevance. Relevance is what the American narrative now risks losing if it remains inward. The world is no longer organized around a single story. Competing histories assert themselves with confidence. Memories once marginalized are now central to global discourse. In this environment, insisting on one version of world history is not a sign of strength. It is a vulnerability. Adaptation requires narrative flexibility. Flexible narratives can incorporate new information without collapse. They can revise without humiliation. They can accept critique without losing identity. World history, according to Americans, has been flexible in content but rigid in orientation. It has added facts without shifting perspective. The next evolution requires shifting perspective. That shift will not happen all at once. It will occur unevenly, contested at every step. Some will experience it as loss, others as correction. But history suggests that societies capable of revising their self-understanding early adapt better than those forced to revise it later under pressure. The American narrative of world history has reached a point where revision is not an intellectual exercise, but a practical necessity. Because the world Americans now inhabit cannot be navigated with the assumptions of a story that placed them at the center, it must be navigated with awareness of crossings, entanglements, and shared consequences. World history, when told that way, does not flatter. It prepares. And preparation, rather than validation, has always been history's most valuable gift. Preparation, however, is not the same as instruction. Instruction tells you what to think. Preparation teaches you how to encounter what you have not yet faced. World history, according to Americans, has often functioned as instruction. It has offered interpretive shortcuts, moral signposts, and familiar arcs that allow the world to be understood quickly. That speed has been an advantage in moments of urgency. It has also been a liability in moments that require patience, because preparation demands slowness. It demands sitting with contradictions that do not resolve. It demands allowing multiple explanations to coexist without forcing them into a single hierarchy. It demands resisting the urge to make the world intelligible on one's own terms alone. This is difficult for any society. It is especially difficult for one whose power has long allowed its interpretations to shape reality. For much of the 20th century, American narratives did not merely explain the world, they organized it. Institutions, alliances, economic frameworks, and cultural norms carried American assumptions outward, embedding them in global systems. When the story said something was universal, it often became so through force of adoption. This feedback loop reinforced confidence in the narrative itself. If the world comes to resemble your story, the story feels true. But resemblance is not confirmation. It can also be the result of constraint. World history taught inwardly rarely pauses to ask which aspects of the modern world emerged through choice and which through necessity imposed by unequal power. It celebrates convergence without fully examining the costs of convergence. This matters now because convergence is slowing. The world is no longer moving uniformly toward a single model. Political forms diversify, economic strategies diverge, cultural assertions strengthen. Memory becomes localized rather than universalized. In this environment, a history that assumes eventual convergence struggles to explain divergence. Why do some societies reject liberal democracy even when it promises prosperity? Why do alternative development models gain traction? Why does resistance to American influence appear even where material benefits exist? The old narrative reaches for familiar explanations. Misinformation, authoritarianism, cultural difference. These explanations contain elements of truth, but they do not exhaust the question. An outward-facing world history suggests another layer. Divergence is not rejection of modernity, but negotiation with it. Societies are not refusing progress. They are choosing which costs they are willing to bear. This choice is deeply historical. Different societies have different memories of what progress required in the past: displacement, exploitation, dependency. Those memories shape present calculations. World history, according to Americans, often assumes that memory fades naturally. Outward history shows that memory persists when its material consequences persist. The American narrative treats the past as something that informs identity. Outward narratives treat it as something that structures options. This difference becomes stark when examining global inequality. In American history education, inequality is often framed as a challenge to be addressed through growth, innovation, and reform. The emphasis is on upward movement. Outward-facing histories emphasize how inequality is reproduced through systems that advantage some positions and constrain others regardless of effort. The emphasis is on structure. The American narrative values mobility. The outward narrative examines immobility. Mobility is inspiring. Immobility is sobering. Both are real, but one has been easier to teach. World history, according to Americans, has been shaped by a belief in mobility, not only social mobility within a society, but historical mobility between societies. It suggests that with the right choices, any nation can move along the same path. This belief aligns with American self-understanding. It also obscures how tightly paths are constrained by starting positions. An outward-facing history does not deny mobility. It contextualizes it. It shows that movement is possible, but uneven. That some societies climb steep slopes while others move on level ground. That some face barriers invisible to those who do not encounter them. This perspective does not eliminate aspiration. It refines it. Refined aspiration understands that emulation is not always possible, and that diversity of paths is not failure, but adaptation. World history, according to Americans, has often framed divergence as lag. Outward-facing history frames it as strategy. This reframing matters because it changes how difference is evaluated. If difference is lag, intervention seems justified. If difference is strategy, intervention requires consent. The American narrative has often assumed the former. This assumption underlies many moments of friction between the United States and the rest of the world. It appears when advice is offered without request, when models are exported without translation, when timelines are imposed without regard for local conditions. These actions are often motivated by confidence rather than contempt. But confidence without historical humility can feel indistinguishable from arrogance. Historical humility does not mean doubting one's values. It means recognizing that values travel differently than institutions, and that history shapes receptivity. World history taught outwardly cultivates this humility by showing how even well-intentioned ideas can fail when detached from context. It shows how revolutions inspired by universal ideals fracture along local lines, how reforms imported wholesale encounter resistance, how institutions transplanted without roots struggle to survive. These lessons are not warnings against engagement. They are warnings against simplification. Simplification has been one of the American narrative's greatest strengths and greatest weaknesses. It made the world teachable. It also made it flatter than it is. As global challenges grow more complex, flat narratives lose explanatory power. They cannot account for feedback loops, unintended consequences, or cascading effects. Climate change is again illustrative. The American narrative tends to frame climate change as a policy problem: emissions, technology, agreements. Outward-facing history frames it as a cumulative legacy of industrialization, colonial extraction, and uneven development. The difference matters because it shapes responsibility. If climate change is a policy problem, responsibility is shared equally moving forward. If it is a historical legacy, responsibility is differentiated based on contribution and benefit. World history, according to Americans, often defaults to the first framing. Outward histories insist on the second. These disagreements are not technical, they are historical. And history education determines which framing feels reasonable. The same applies to migration. American narratives often frame migration as a present challenge driven by instability elsewhere. Outward histories frame it as the continuation of long patterns shaped by economic integration, intervention, and environmental change. One framing emphasizes border control. The other emphasizes global responsibility. Neither is complete alone. World history, when taught as entanglement, allows both to coexist. It does not force a single solution. It clarifies the stakes. Clarifying stakes is what mature history does best. It shows what is at risk, who bears the cost, and how the past constrains the future. World history, according to Americans, has often clarified identity more than stakes. It has told Americans who they are rather than what their actions produce. The next evolution of that history must invert the emphasis. It must ask not only how America emerged, but how America affects. It must teach not only what America values, but how those values interact with histories that do not share the same starting point. This is not an easy shift. It requires rewriting curricula, retraining instincts, and tolerating discomfort. But it is already happening, unevenly. Students encounter alternative narratives through global media. Scholars challenge inherited frameworks. Communities with transnational ties bring other memories into public discourse. The monopoly on world history has eroded. The question is whether the American narrative adapts proactively or defensively. Defensive narratives harden boundaries. Adaptive narratives expand context. History suggests that adaptive narratives endure longer. They allow societies to revise without rupture. They absorb critique without collapse. They prepare citizens for change rather than shielding them from it. World history, at its best, does not tell a society what it wants to hear. It tells it what it needs to understand. The American story of world history has reached a moment where understanding matters more than reassurance, because the world Americans now face is not a continuation of the one their narrative was built to explain. It is more crowded, more contested, more interconnected, more fragile. In such a world, the greatest historical advantage is not confidence, it is awareness. Awareness of limits, awareness of legacy, awareness of others' pasts intersecting with one's own. World history taught with that awareness does not diminish national identity. It grounds it. It replaces myth with memory, certainty with judgment, dominance with responsibility. That replacement is not an ending. It is the beginning of a different kind of historical engagement, one that treats the past not as a justification for where we stand, but as a guide for how we move. And movement, guided by history rather than driven by assumption, is the only way forward in a world no longer willing to revolve around a single story. And yet, even as that need becomes clearer, the habit of the old story remains powerful. Habits formed through education do not disappear simply because they are questioned. They linger in language, in metaphors, in instinctive reactions to global events. They surface when Americans describe other nations as emerging, failing, or behind, as though history were a single road with traffic moving at different speeds. These words are not neutral. They carry the imprint of a narrative that assumes direction and destination. World history, according to Americans, has long taught that direction implicitly. It taught that history moves from tradition to modernity, from hierarchy to equality, from scarcity to abundance. Even when this movement is interrupted, it is assumed to resume eventually. This assumption is deeply comforting. It implies that setbacks are temporary and that the future will resemble the present, only more so. But history does not guarantee resemblance. Many societies in the past believed they stood at the height of development. Many assumed their systems were stable, their dominance justified, their future secure. They told histories that reinforced those beliefs. Rome did. Imperial China did. European empires did. Their confidence did not save them from transformation. World history, when examined closely, is not a story of steady ascent punctuated by setbacks. It is a story of reconfiguration. Centers shift, systems mutate, values are reinterpreted under pressure. The American narrative, shaped during a period of unprecedented dominance, reflects the conditions of its birth. It makes sense of a world in which American influence expanded rapidly and seemingly inexorably. That expansion shaped not only policy, but imagination. It taught Americans to expect alignment between their intentions and global outcomes. It taught them to see resistance as misunderstanding rather than as historically grounded disagreement. As that alignment weakens, the narrative's explanatory power fades. This is not a failure of patriotism. It is a mismatch between story and reality. Reality now presents Americans with a world that does not organize itself around their assumptions. Alliances shift, norms fragment, power diffuses, memory resurfaces in unexpected places. In this world, insisting on the old narrative does not restore coherence. It deepens confusion. The alternative is not to abandon narrative altogether. Humans need stories to orient themselves. The alternative is to tell a story that accepts instability as normal rather than aberrant. World history, told as entanglement and reconfiguration, offers that story. It teaches that no arrangement is final, that dominance produces vulnerability as well as advantage, that power invites challenge as surely as it invites compliance. These lessons do not encourage withdrawal, they encourage calibration. Calibration is different from control. Control assumes that outcomes can be directed if force or persuasion is sufficient. Calibration assumes that outcomes emerge from interaction and must be adjusted to, rather than commanded. World history, according to Americans, has often emphasized control, economic, military, ideological. Outward-facing history emphasizes calibration. Calibration requires listening. Listening requires humility. Humility requires historical awareness. This chain is difficult to sustain in a culture that values decisiveness and clarity, but it is necessary in a world where actions ripple across systems too complex to be fully predicted. The American narrative of world history has long emphasized clarity. It has drawn clear lines between freedom and oppression, progress and stagnation, leadership and failure. Those lines made sense in a bipolar world. They make less sense in a multipolar one. Multipolarity does not mean chaos. It means plural centers of meaning. Different societies prioritize different values based on their histories. Security may matter more than liberty in one context. Stability may matter more than growth in another. Memory may matter more than innovation. World history taught inwardly struggles to accept this plurality. It tends to evaluate difference against a single standard. World history taught outwardly explains difference without ranking it prematurely. This does not mean all systems are equally just or effective. It means judgment is informed by context rather than assumption. Contextual judgment is slower. It frustrates the desire for quick moral resolution, but it produces fewer miscalculations. Misunderstanding history is one of the most reliable ways to misunderstand the present. When Americans encounter global resistance to their initiatives, they often interpret it as irrational or ideological. Outward-facing history reveals it as cumulative, a response shaped by past interventions, broken promises, or uneven outcomes. These responses are not always justified, but they are rarely inexplicable. History explains them, if it is allowed to. World history, according to Americans, has often been selective in what it allows history to explain. It explains American emergence thoroughly. It explains global reaction selectively. The next step is to reverse that emphasis, to explain not only how America came to be powerful, but how that power has been experienced. Experience is not measured in treaties or GDP. It is measured in disrupted livelihoods, altered institutions, reshaped expectations. Those experiences do not disappear when formal relationships change. They persist as memory. Memory shapes trust. Trust shapes cooperation. World history education that ignores memory cannot explain trust. This is why outward-facing history matters not only academically but politically. It prepares citizens to understand why some appeals resonate and others fail, why some alliances endure and others fray. It teaches that legitimacy is not self-generated. It is granted by others based on experience. The American narrative has often assumed legitimacy as a function of ideals. Outward history shows it is also a function of impact. Impact is harder to measure than intention. It requires listening to those affected rather than those acting. This is uncomfortable because it cedes interpretive authority. World history, according to Americans, has long placed interpretive authority at the center. It has treated American categories as universal and American timelines as normative. Decentering that authority does not erase it. It contextualizes it. Contextual authority is more resilient than absolute authority. It adapts. It learns. It responds. History offers many examples of societies that refused to revise their narratives until revision was forced upon them by collapse or humiliation. It also offers examples of societies that adjusted their self-understanding gradually and survived transformation with less trauma. Which path America takes is not predetermined, but the choice begins with how the past is taught. If world history continues to be taught primarily as a story that culminates in American leadership, Americans will continue to expect the world to align with that story. If world history is taught as a story of intersecting trajectories in which America plays a major but not singular role, expectations will adjust. Adjusted expectations do not weaken resolve, they sharpen strategy. Strategy grounded in historical realism is less prone to surprise. It anticipates resistance. It respects constraint. It values partnership over prescription. These are not signs of decline, they are signs of maturity. The American narrative of world history was forged in a moment when confidence was rewarded. Its next iteration must be forged in a moment when awareness is required. Awareness does not provide easy answers. It complicates them. But history has never promised ease. It promises understanding, if one is willing to let go of the idea that one story can contain the world. The world has always exceeded its narrators. It exceeds America, too. And recognizing that does not make the American story smaller. It places it, finally, where all histories belong, within a world that was never waiting, never finished, and never owned by any single voice. And once that recognition settles in, once the idea that no single voice owns the past becomes something more than an abstract claim, the purpose of world history itself begins to shift. History stops being a ledger of achievement and becomes a record of relationship. This is a fundamental change. It alters not only what is remembered, but why it is remembered at all. World history, according to Americans, has long functioned as an explanation of success. It has shown how certain ideas triumphed, how certain systems prevailed, how certain nations rose to prominence. Even when suffering is acknowledged, it is often framed as a toll paid on the way to something larger and more stable. But relationship-centered history asks different questions. Not who won, but who was bound to whom. Not what worked, but who paid the cost when it did. Not where did history lead, but what did history connect, and what did those connections do over time? These questions destabilize triumphal narratives because they refuse to isolate outcomes from processes. They insist that success cannot be understood without examining dependency, extraction, cooperation, and resistance together. For Americans, this reframing challenges a deeply ingrained habit, the separation of domestic history from global history. In the American imagination, these two realms are often taught as parallel but distinct. American history is personal, intimate, moral. World history is distant, expansive, contextual. This separation allows Americans to recognize injustice at home while overlooking its global analogs. It allows structural critique domestically and moral storytelling internationally. An outward-facing world history collapses that distinction. It shows that the same forces shaping American society, capital accumulation, labor exploitation, territorial expansion, institutional design, operated globally, often in more extreme forms. It reveals that American domestic history cannot be fully understood without global context, and that global history cannot be fully understood without American participation. This mutual implication is uncomfortable because it dissolves moral distance. Distance allows judgment without introspection. Proximity demands reflection. World history, according to Americans, has long preserved distance. It has allowed Americans to see themselves as observers, arbiters, and helpers rather than as embedded actors. That position is increasingly untenable. Global supply chains tie American consumption to labor conditions elsewhere. Environmental impacts cross borders. Financial systems link prosperity and precarity. Cultural influence reshapes identities far from its point of origin. These are not abstract connections. They are lived realities. World history, when taught as relationship, makes these realities intelligible rather than surprising. It shows that globalization is not new, that interdependence is not optional, that isolation has always been partial and temporary. This perspective reframes debates that otherwise appear purely political. Migration, for example, looks different when understood historically. Instead of appearing as sudden movement toward opportunity, it appears as the continuation of patterns set in motion by trade, conquest, intervention, and environmental change. From an inward-facing narrative, migration is a problem to manage. From an outward-facing narrative, it is a consequence to understand. Understanding does not eliminate the need for policy, but it changes its tone. Policy informed by inward history seeks control. Policy informed by outward history seeks accommodation. Accommodation is not surrender, it is adjustment to reality. World history, according to Americans, has often emphasized control because it aligned with a period of relative dominance. But as that dominance becomes more contested, control produces diminishing returns. Accommodation, by contrast, acknowledges limits. It accepts that influence must be negotiated, that legitimacy must be earned repeatedly, and that outcomes will be shared. Shared outcomes are harder to celebrate. They do not belong cleanly to any one actor. They resist national ownership, but they are more stable. History suggests that systems endure not when one power dominates indefinitely, but when multiple actors find ways to coexist within shared constraints. The American narrative has often treated coexistence as a temporary phase between moments of decisive leadership. Outward-facing history treats it as the norm. This shift changes how Americans interpret conflict. Conflict is no longer a sign that the system is broken. It is a sign that multiple histories are colliding. Collision does not always require resolution. Sometimes it requires management, containment, compromise, recalibration. World history taught as entanglement prepares citizens for this kind of management. It tempers expectations of victory. It values sustainability over triumph. These values sit uneasily with heroic national myths, but they align closely with historical reality. The most enduring periods in world history are not those defined by conquest, but by negotiated order, however imperfect. The Pax Romana, the tributary systems of East Asia, the balance of power arrangements in early modern Europe, all were unstable, contested, and unjust in various ways. Yet they endured longer than moments of pure domination. American world history has often highlighted moments of decisive change rather than long stretches of negotiated continuity. It has celebrated disruption more than maintenance. This preference reflects cultural values. It also limits understanding. Maintenance is unglamorous. Negotiation is slow. Compromise is ambiguous. But maintenance, negotiation, and compromise are what keep complex systems from collapsing. World history, when told honestly, is largely the story of these quiet processes. The American narrative, shaped by revolutionary origins and frontier expansion, has emphasized beginnings and breakthroughs. It has been less attentive to what follows, the work of sustaining, repairing, and adapting institutions over time. That work is now central. The global challenges of the present, climate change, technological disruption, demographic shifts, cannot be solved through breakthroughs alone. They require sustained coordination across histories that do not share the same memories or priorities. World history taught inwardly offers little guidance here. It prepares citizens for leadership, not for mutual adjustment. World history taught outwardly prepares citizens to recognize that leadership, in such contexts, often means restraint. Restraint is not retreat. It is discipline. It is the ability to act without assuming control, to influence without expecting compliance, to participate without dominating the narrative. These capacities are not instinctive. They must be learned. History education is one of the few places where such learning can occur systematically, but only if history is taught as more than validation. World history, according to Americans, has long validated a sense of purpose and moral orientation. That function was not illegitimate. It served a society navigating rapid change and global responsibility. The question is whether it can evolve. Evolution does not require abandoning pride or confidence. It requires integrating them with awareness, awareness of legacy, awareness of asymmetry, awareness of others' memories intersecting with one's own. This integration produces a different kind of confidence, one that is quieter, less declarative, more conditional. Conditional confidence is harder to perform politically. It does not lend itself to slogans. It resists absolute claims, but it is historically durable. History favors societies that can revise their self-understanding without losing cohesion. Those that mistake coherence for truth eventually encounter realities their narratives cannot absorb. The American story of world history has been coherent. It now faces realities that demand expansion. That expansion will be uneven. Some institutions will adapt faster than others. Some narratives will persist longer than they should. Resistance will be framed as loyalty. Revision will be framed as betrayal. This is normal. Every shift in historical consciousness encounters resistance because it threatens identity. But identity grounded in myth is fragile. Identity grounded in understanding is resilient. World history, told as relationship rather than ascent, offers that resilience. It allows Americans to see themselves not as the authors of the world's story, but as inheritors of a complex past whose consequences they now share. It allows them to act without illusion, to engage without certainty, and to listen without surrendering agency. This is not a call to diminish America's role in history. It is a call to place that role accurately. America has been, and remains, one of the most consequential actors in the modern world. Its ideas, institutions, and decisions have shaped lives far beyond its borders. Acknowledging that influence fully means acknowledging its costs as well as its achievements. World history, according to Americans, has often emphasized the latter. The future of that history depends on integrating the former. Integration is not condemnation. It is comprehension. And comprehension is what history ultimately offers. Not comfort, not absolution, but the capacity to see how the world became what it is, and how actions taken now will echo long after intentions are forgotten. The world does not need a single story. It needs many stories held in tension. When Americans learn to tell their story alongside others, without insisting it resolve the whole, world history becomes what it was always meant to be. Not a celebration of arrival, but a guide for coexistence in a world shaped by shared, uneven, and unfinished pasts. And so we arrive not at an ending, but at a clearing, a place where the noise of certainty falls away, and what remains is orientation. World history, according to Americans, began as a way of mastering scale. It took an impossibly large past and rendered it navigable. It offered coherence where chaos threatened. It provided a moral spine strong enough to carry responsibility, leadership, and belief in progress. That story mattered. It still does. But stories are not static instruments. They age. They encounter realities they were not designed to explain. And when that happens, the danger is not that the story will be criticized, but that it will be clung to long after it has stopped working. The American version of world history has reached that moment. Not because it is false, but because it is insufficient. It tells Americans how they came to power. It does not always tell them how power feels to others. It explains success. It struggles with consequence. It offers validation. It resists implication. And yet, the world Americans now inhabit is defined less by ascent than by entanglement. Supply chains bind distant lives. Climate binds futures across borders. Technology binds narratives, memories, and grievances into a single contested space. In such a world, history cannot function as reassurance. It must function as preparation. Preparation for misunderstanding. Preparation for resistance. Preparation for outcomes that diverge from intention. Preparation, above all, for humility. Humility is not the opposite of strength. It is the discipline that allows strength to endure. Empires that fell did not fall because they lacked power. They fell because their stories could no longer absorb reality. They mistook dominance for permanence. They mistook coherence for truth. They mistook their own perspective for the world's. World history, when told honestly, warns against this mistake again and again. The Roman world believed it was civilization itself. European empires believed they were history's engine. Each told stories that centered their experience, justified their expansion, and framed resistance as disorder. Those stories felt true until they didn't. America is not immune to this pattern. No society is. The question is not whether the American narrative will be challenged. It already is. The question is whether it will adapt. Adaptation does not require abandoning ideals. It requires placing them in history rather than above it. It requires recognizing that freedom has been experienced differently depending on where one stood, that prosperity has been built unevenly, that stability for some has meant disruption for others. These recognitions do not negate American achievement. They contextualize it. And context is what turns history from myth into understanding. Understanding does not paralyze action. It disciplines it. It slows the rush to explain. It sharpens the instinct to listen. It replaces certainty with judgment. Judgment is what history ultimately trains. Not the judgment of others alone, but judgment of one's own assumptions, inherited stories, and reflexive responses. World history, according to Americans, has long trained citizens to see themselves as actors in a global drama with a clear moral arc. The next stage of that history must train them to see themselves as participants in a shared, uneven, and unresolved process. A process where no one stands outside history, where no one escapes consequence, where no one owns the final interpretation. That shift is not a loss of meaning. It is a gain in depth. Depth allows a society to remain coherent without becoming rigid. It allows pride without denial. It allows responsibility without illusion. In the end, world history is not a story about who the world belongs to. It is a story about how people, in different places and times, tried to live with power, scarcity, belief, fear, and hope, and how their attempts shaped others they would never meet. America is one of those stories, a powerful one, a consequential one, but still one among many. To tell it honestly, alongside others, is not to diminish it. It is to finally let it grow up, because the world was never waiting, history was never finished, and no nation was ever meant to stand alone at the center of it all. World history does not ask for allegiance, it asks for attention, and attention, careful, disciplined, historically informed, is the rarest and most powerful form of respect a society can offer the past, the present, and the future. It is still helping to shape